Hello everyone and welcome to today's Capital Connect webinar, Sustainability and Body Corporate. My name is Larissa and I'm a Community Relationship Manager at our Redcliffe Office and I'll be your host for today. This webinar will be presented by Chris Duggan, the Group Managing Director at Brighton Duggan Property Group and President of Strata Community Association Australasia, James Nickless, Partner at Chambers Russell Lawyers, and Julie MacCarthy, our Senior Community Relationship Manager at our Redcliffe Office. You can expect each presenter to have the floor for about 10 minutes. And by the time we finish up today, we hope you can take away some valuable information about the impact of sustainability in strata community schemes and knowledge of body corporate financials. Here at Capital, we are very passionate about working with owners to create happy, healthy and harmonious communities. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the Zoom attendee interface and you should see that on your screen and that's what you will see on your presentation throughout today. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we'll collate these and address as many as possible at the end of today's presentation. This is a 1-hour webinar and it will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel. You will also receive an email containing the recording. During our live Q&A, #AskCapital, we will keep your submitted questions anonymous. Following the webinar, we will be seeking your feedback and attendees who leave their feedback by 5 p.m. Monday, the 26th of September, will go into the draw to win a $100 prepaid Visa card, and that will be drawn on Tuesday, the 27th of September. So here is an overview of our presentation today. We're privileged to have Chris Duggan, Group Managing Director at Brighton Duggan Property Group and President at Strata Community Association Australasia. Chris is one of the country's best known strata leaders and innovators in the property industry. Chris's expertise is in complex scheme consulting and establishment, having overseen the establishment of Australia's most complex strata communities and mixed-use developments. Chris will give an in-depth insight to the impacts of sustainability and how it will shape the future in strata. Over to you, Chris.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Larissa. Much appreciated. And I'm delighted to be here at the Capital Connect webinar talking to you all. As Larissa said, I'm hoping to give you an overview in the context of my role as the President of Strata Community Association, but also as the Group Managing Director of the Brighton Duggan Property Group, which includes the Capital Body Corporate team, and also my own experiences over the years advising, dealing with and assisting owners, corporations and body corporates try to get the maximum value they can out of their buildings through leaning into sustainability options. So I wanted to give the context in the next slide, if you don't mind, around why this is such an important conversation. We had the benefit of a recent federal election where the conversation around net zero aspirations were first and foremost from both sides of the political aisle. Part of our engagement and lobbying at an industry level was to highlight and ensure that strata and body corporate, meaning apartments more generally across Australia, weren't left behind with a lot of the policy development that occurred to date. Historically, most, if not all, the policy development around housing was for standalone properties. But as we know, the vast majority of the east coast of Australia is quickly stratifying, and by 2030, over half of the east coast of Australia will be living in apartments or titled dwellings. So we identified that there is a $1.3 trillion strata sector, which is the sleeping giant. And the further benefit of that is every time a dollar is spent investing in a strata or an owners corporation or a body corporate, that is a magnified impact because of the multiplier effect and the economies of scale that come based on the fact that multiple people live within and reside in those properties. Very pleasingly, at the back end of the election, the Labor government made significant commitments to the apartment sector to make sure that moving forward, policy was not going to be blind to apartment living and that there would be more focused highlights around policies, grants, investment legislation specific to ensuring that apartments that you live in get the benefit of both new apartments and retrofitted initiatives to support sustainability. So moving to our next slide, we understand that multiplier impact means that every dollar spent, if I could just jump us across to the next.
Next slide.
There we go, we got there. Fabulous. We understand the fact that there is this multiplier impact. I guess the question is, and this is probably what you may have experienced in your own situation, is what is stopping us? What are those inherent limitations to why we haven't adopted what is now intuitively understood to be good practice, better living decisions around sustainability, but ultimately better governance around how we manage our buildings? And I've put them into 5 buckets, and those 5 buckets are really the main reasons why we haven't seen as much progress as we'd like to see. So the first around the physical. Let's talk about the fact that retrofitting sustainability initiatives means that you have to fit them in to the physical constraints that exist in your building. They're often spatially constrained, particularly when we talk about rooftop installations, which a lot of the infrastructure needs to be placed if we need new plant, new machinery, photovoltaic stills, or even plant machinery. So that inherent limitation that exists in existing buildings has meant that a lot of projects have stopped at that first hurdle. Now, they can be overcome these days, particularly with technology advancements and the fact that there are a lot of initiatives around how some of these off-site sustainability initiatives can be plugged into your building. The second major limitation is around cost. And as we know, with the collective decision-making around body corporates, cost is always important. In fact, it's critically important to make sure that everyone understands what they're paying for and the collective benefit. However, historically, that cost limitation has caused projects to stop right when it gets to that value assessment or the cost-benefit analysis. The third significant limitation, which has been across the country, is that our legislation hasn't been made to support retrofitting activities. What I mean by that is, in most jurisdictions, including in Queensland, you need to put in place special resolutions and others which require a vast majority of owners to agree. And as we know, getting owners to commit to a number of initiatives, particularly those that have a cost attached to them, may not be that easy to support when you require majorities. So there is being work done, and I'll touch on some of those remedies. The fourth factor is the demographic, I guess, diversity that exists across strata living. Strata is a microcosm of Australian living, so it's got people from all walks of life, it's got lots of different demographics, and it's also got, I think, a reflection of the fact that we're now starting to see people spending more times in their home, but as at a decade ago, the average tenure in an apartment in Australia was only 6 years. That means that the decision-making around the cost-benefit analysis needed to be put into that type of context so that people making decisions that they would get the benefit from. Fortunately, we've seen that grow out now to about 9 years and growing as people now start to invest more in the places they live, which means those arguments are going to be less impacted by, obviously, the tenure debate. And the final is historical ideological clashes. So we've previously framed sustainability initiatives, rightly or wrongly, around climate change in some regards. And that, depending on the way you feel, has sometimes been a limitation. And I wanted to put these 5 things on paper for you so that you saw what stopped us in the past. Let's turn around how we reframe that conversation. So my view and my experience, and this is where a lot of the focus is now on, is reframing the conversation around from those sustainability heavy issues to talking about features in a property and what features buyers look for. And the importance of doing this is that now that we've identified, and we'll talk to the material impact of some of these efficiencies and the uplift they provide to value, but now that we start to talk in the context of what are buyers looking for, what are occupants looking for, they're looking for features in their property. So not necessarily the widgets themselves, but the benefits and the outcomes of those initiatives. So greater efficiency. We're looking for buildings that save money, i.e. we're in an increasingly living pressure increased environment. So what initiatives can be put in place to save money? Conversely, let's stop wasting money. What can we directly do to make sure that unnecessarily spending can be stopped? When you frame the conversation around those 2 areas and those features, it turns the narrative on its head and it starts to focus on what people are looking for out of their property, particularly as an investment, but also as a cost base. The second is year-round comfort. We're now making decisions around living, owning and investing in properties based on comfort factors, which then flows into health. And you can see now that we've turned the narrative from the, I guess, more difficult conversations around legislation, cost, demographics, to what features are you looking for, what aspirations would you like in your building, and then how can the investment in those sustainability initiatives actually support those. Affordability and the affordability crisis, particularly in housing, is going to be probably one of the leading measures behind why buildings will look to start saving money and stop wasting money. And the final is climate readiness, particularly as we've seen in Brisbane more recently with the floods on an ongoing basis. We need to be doing things better to mitigate our properties to ensure that the cost long-term of maintaining them can be reduced through thoughtful investment in climate readiness mitigation. So what do these features look like? So these features I've broken down into the practical initiatives that can be considered. And what I would encourage you to do is make sure you reach out to your body corporate expert at Capital, who can put you in touch with either their own team or other experts around what initiatives are available to you. But please ensure that you are at least assessing what opportunities are available to you. On the energy and water efficiency side, there is arguably the lowest hanging fruit. The first on the energy side, particularly in a market where energy costs are increasing, is to ensure you're on the correct tariff. And that means talking to your body corporate manager, ensuring that they've got the right tariff for your building based on its size and your use. The second is things like power factor correction and how efficiently you use that energy when it comes into your building. Small tweaks in this regard have long and big impacts. Water efficiency, particularly where body corporates pay for the common property usage, have huge benefit from looking at what efficient fittings and fixtures can be installed throughout the property at low cost to try and stop that. And even if your body corporate doesn't pay it and you pay it individually, either your tenant or yourself, ensure that your water efficiency is up to date, because those types of small changes have long-term impacts. Likewise, heating, cooling and hot water solutions. Depending on the size of your property, there will be a raft of opportunities around lighting solutions, whether it be changing the tubes across to LED or other more efficient lighting, different sensors, particularly for car park arrangements, or hot water solutions that may be in play. Plant and machinery, and I put here VSD, which are called variable speed drives. This is ensuring that your equipment, whether it be pits in the basement, pumps for stormwater, extraction fans, they're not constantly running, or that they don't run at one speed, which means by being able to dial up and dial down the speed and the velocity of these machines, you can significantly reduce both the cost to maintain, the electricity consumption, but also the capital, because you're more efficiently using these plants and machinery. EV charging, which I'll touch on a little bit, has probably been the focus more recently on a lot of the public narrative around sustainability. That's a relatively high cost, but also a very essential, critical infrastructure that needs to be considered. And I'll talk to some of the initiatives, particularly the government support that applies there. Waste recycling and upcycling is about how we better use, as a community, the resources we have, and then how we recycle, we dispose of, and the like. Now, waste management done correctly can be a huge saving, but recycling and upcycling also can tie into the fact that buildings as a community working together can try and solve broader problems than just cost and other initiatives. Solar PV, again, historically limited to what roof space or what capability you had to physically install the infrastructure. There are now innovative solutions in place where you can buy solar PV off-site, you can plug into solar power, you can do a whole bunch more green initiatives than simply having a limited space. But if you do have that space and you wish to review solar PV, there are a number of government supports initiatives at a local, state and federal level that you need to be considering. Battery storage, again, traditionally an expensive solution, but more and more affordable, particularly as those subsidies are in place from a government level, but also long-term benefit, particularly in areas that have highly volatile temperature or climate zones, where you can store battery, store solar, store power and use it more effectively. And finally, make sure you also consider some of the passive options available to you. Ventilation, particularly on the East Coast with the rain weather events we've had. I know in New South Wales we're experiencing high levels of mould, and very basic ventilation has solved that in the long run by keeping air flowing through. Also, passive insulation around trapping in heat and cooling into your property. Again, stop the need for your building to use so much so that you don't have to pay so much in the long run. So to give some broader context around what's happening in Australia. So at a legislative level, I mentioned that there's been historically a lack of legislation that supports good decision making. And we've seen that fortunately addressed more recently with a focus on how we reduce threshold potentially for decisions around sustainability initiatives. In New South Wales, for example, it was previously a major resolution or a special resolution of 75% of those owners present. It is now an ordinary resolution. So we brought the threshold down to 50% for sustainability initiatives. And those types of discussions have been had across the country to ensure that the government provides the proper lever around legislation to support good decision making. Secondly, government policy. And I mentioned before, EV policy is a particular focus. There is a focus at the moment, particularly off the back of the federal election, where Labor has committed to 400 community batteries and solar banks, which will be targeting apartments across the country. There are a number of initiatives which at a high level make sure that buildings are built better and more sustainably, but also things like neighbours ratings, which is a rating around the environmental performance of your building being potentially made mandatory for residential over time. Because if you can't measure it, you can't obviously improve it. And that is a consistent theme that we're seeing across the spectrum when it comes to apartment buildings, which have always been left behind rating tools, behind performance, and behind the metrics so that we can make informed decisions. Programs and grants that are applicable, please ensure that you reach out, because there are a number of programs, regardless of where you live, which apply to your areas. And the most effective ones we've seen across the country have been those driven at a local government level. The City of Sydney in New South Wales has a program called the Smart Green Apartment Program. And for every apartment block that's participated, they've experienced on average a 30% reduction in their energy costs. This is through a series of tweaks to a whole bunch of the initiatives and those features that I mentioned earlier, but it's the small little changes that have material impacts long term. Likewise, we've seen the New South Wales government commit $10 million specifically to EV support for Strata, and everywhere across the country we're now seeing a ramp up of these types of local, state and federal programs and grants to support. So please, if you're thinking about doing anything for your building, reach out and ask what's available to you. Finally, education and awareness. At all levels, from government through to planners, developers, builders, real estate agents, owners, there has been a significant increase in awareness, particularly around body corporates and their impact. We're starting to see policy that is no longer blind to multi-unit apartment dwelling. We're starting to see the proper investments in waking that sleeping giant and utilising that multiplier impact. And if you go and have a look, a lot of the online resources specifically targeted to, for example, EV charging, has a particular focus on apartment living and how that can be done. And I would encourage you, even if it's not specific to your state, to Google some of these very good education and awareness programs that have been put out by government and private institutions about how you can educate and upskill yourself so that you're more aware of how to adopt these initiatives, and also how to deal with some of those roadblocks traditionally around getting decision making in strata and body corporate. Finally, and most appropriately, we need to talk about the fact, and this is really important considering the flow on, and James is going to talk about finances in body corporates, is it makes good financial sense. Don't trust me, trust the fact that independent reviews and reports by Domain Sustainability and Property Report in 2022, so this is as current as it gets, indicates that in Queensland, apartment prices are 17.6% higher where environmental or energy efficient features are prevalent as opposed to those that don't. So they've taken the advertising material behind those apartments with energy efficient features, which, as we went back to, are all those things that are people looking for around lifestyle, energy and cost, and they've correlated that with a 17.6% increase in the value of those properties. So that needs to be in consideration, not only when you do your cost benefit analysis on the payback period, but the uplift in the value of your property compared to non-energy efficient buildings is significant. So hopefully in that short period of time, I've given you an understanding of the opportunities, but also the fact that you need to start looking at stop wasting money and start saving money about how we can implement more features to ensure that our buildings, particularly apartment buildings, are more energy efficient and sustainable. Thanks, Larissa. That's my overview.
Thanks, Chris. I'll be the next presenter for today's session. Those that do not know me, I'm Larissa, a Community Relationship Manager in our Redcliffe office. I've been working in the strata industry for over 8 years, and in that time I have worked with strata communities of different shapes and sizes. My focus today is on body corporate financials and lot owner contributions. So firstly, I'm just going to touch on the basic financial requirements for bodies corporate. And that is, a body corporate must establish and maintain an administrative and a sinking fund. That includes preparing budgets and collecting owner contributions to fund expenses from the necessary fund. The budget set by a body corporate must forecast anticipated expenditure, and I'll shortly touch on what expenses come from what fund. The budgets and corresponding levies are adopted by owners at the annual general meeting. The motions to adopt each budget must detail the number of instalments, the amounts payable per lot entitlement, and the due date. It's often asked if a surplus from the administrative fund can be transferred into the sinking fund, or can funds be transferred from the sinking fund to the administrative fund to recover a shortfall of funds, for example. The legislation states that funds must not be transferred between the administrative and sinking funds. Administrative and sinking fund budgets are set to meet the needs of each individual body corporate. Every strata scheme has its own level of spending, and no two schemes have identical needs. Budgets and corresponding contributions are unique to an individual body corporate based on several factors, including their age, size, location, and facilities. There is no legislative benchmark or suggested levies for communities simply based on their size, and all body corporates must determine their budgets and contributions individually. So the administrative fund. So the administrative fund is used to fund the day-to-day essential costs of the body corporate and specifically recurring expenses. This includes general common property and asset maintenance, such as plumbing, grounds maintenance, electrical, insurance premiums, common property utilities, service contractors, and administrative services, such as a body corporate manager, just to name a few. All of these components are presented as individual line items and make up the budget, and this is then how lot owner contributions are determined each year. As for the sinking fund, it is actually reserved for larger one-off expenses such as your painting, structural repairs, fencing, and major projects alike. The body corporate is required to reserve funds to meet likely future capital expenditure for at least the current financial year and at least 9 years after the current financial year. A sinking fund is often prepared to assist the committee with setting sinking fund budgets that incorporate increments to meet those capital expenses as they become due. The body corporate can invest money from the sinking fund if it's not needed immediately to fund capital works, and typically funds are invested into a term deposit for a term agreed to by the body corporate. As mentioned earlier, budgets are estimates of anticipated expenditure of the body corporate and form the foundations to determine the contributions payable by lot owners to meet the needs of the body corporate. Capital liaises with the committee to prepare the proposed budgets that are distributed with the AGM material and subsequently decided by lot owners at the AGM. The proposed budgets are enclosed with the meeting material for owners to preview how their levies contribute to the operations of their body corporate. Every body corporate has a community management statement, which is a document that identifies the essential information registered to that strata title, including the schedule of lot entitlements, which is used to calculate a lot owner's share of body corporate expenses. In some cases, not every lot in a scheme will have equal entitlements, meaning each lot owner does not contribute the same as all other lots. You can retrieve a copy of the CMS, the Community Management Statement, for your body corporate from the Capital's Owners Portal at any time. Administrative and sinking fund levies payable for each lot are based on the contribution schedule of lot entitlements. For schemes where the lots have differing interest entitlements, owners will contribute to the building component of the body corporate's insurance based on the interest schedule of lot entitlements. In these instances, there will be an insurance fund budget voted on at the AGM in addition to your standard administrative and sinking fund levies. Some bodies corporate offer a discount for levies paid by the due date. In accordance with legislation, the discount cannot exceed more than 20% of the instalment amount. A body corporate may also apply penalty interest on contributions that are not paid by the due date, and the penalty applied is simple interest set at a rate that cannot exceed 2.5% for each month that the contributions are overdue. To implement a discount or penalty interest, the body corporate must pass a motion by ordinary resolution at a general meeting to do so. To remove either of those two, the body corporate must rescind the original resolution resolving to apply the discount or the penalty. The body corporate may decide to allow the discount or waive interest charges if they are satisfied circumstances warrant the allowance. Surprise expenses. So if an unforeseen liability arises that has not been budgeted for, or there is no provision to meet the expense in the budget, then the body corporate must raise a special levy to pay the cost. This is done by ordinary resolution at a general meeting. The same process occurs if the body corporate wishes to carry out works or an improvement for which is not accounted for in the budget. For projects of a larger nature, there is the option to consider a strata loan, and the regulation module applying to the scheme will determine the necessary resolution required to borrow funds. That is my section of financials. So we'll now move on to our live Q&A, #AskCapital, with our presenters. So let's bring back Chris Duggan, the Managing Director of Brighton Duggan Group, owner-operator of Strata and facilities management brands across Australia. With a land economics degree from UTS and having worked in the development industry for 10 years with major listed property and funds management companies, Chris is a passionate advocate for the development of professionalism in strata and peer-to-peer collaboration. We also have James Nickless, a partner at Chambers Russell Lawyers. James manages the firm's Queensland practice and an expert in strata title law and litigation with extensive experience in general commercial litigation, building and construction disputes, debt recovery and insolvency. And lucky last, Julie MacCarthy, one of Capital's senior community relationship managers and our business and systems innovations manager. Julie brings 16 years experience in body corporate management with her strong understanding of business requirements. This allows her to mentor and provide practical solutions whilst being an empathetic manager. Julie also takes great delight to be a member of the SCA Queensland Education Committee. Please type your questions now into the questions pane, which you'll view on your screen there. If you have any pressing questions about body corporate levies and budgets or sustainability in strata, this is now your chance to ask. If we do not get to your question today, we will ensure it is followed up and addressed following today's session.
Julie, how do you want us to drive this section? Do you want us to just jump in and answer the questions that we think are most relevant to us, or do you want to assign them to us? I can't hear you, Julie. Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you, James.
We can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Well, look, I might just do a bit of filler and I'll jump in and answer the question around the regulation module changes for defect inspections. So yes, in the changes that came into effect in March this year, it is now obligatory for new schemes to consider a defect rectification motion at their second annual general meeting. And people might say, why the second one? Well, sometimes the original owner developer is still in control at the first annual general meeting. So at the second annual general meeting, they must consider that. Doesn't mean they actually have to do the inspection, but they have to consider a motion that contemplates that they'll do the inspection. I would highly recommend that defect inspections take place. Would also highly recommend that schemes that aren't captured by those regulation changes do it anyway as a matter of best practice. And something that I was going to say in comment to the material that Chris discussed earlier is one of the big difficulties in strata is getting people to move from mere legislative compliance, a piece of legislation tells me I should do it, so I will, through to best practice. And things like the neighbours rating system and other green initiatives are really kind of at the moment more towards the best practice end. And so there's a big sort of push to work out how do we get schemes to actually act in their best interest, not merely just legislative compliance. I can keep filling the airwaves, but I'll see if Julie's back on track.
It'd be good if you could follow on for now, James. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly, will do. So something that, again, I'll answer some of these questions in a moment, but something that just popped out to me again in between the other presentations was the fact that because of the way in which body corporate expenses are approved, you can have all the best intentions in the world and then hit a bunch of trip hazards in terms of trying to get the regulatory compliance for approvals. So as was mentioned before, a budget is an estimate only, but when it comes to actually planning for some of these projects, it's really important to be proactive and to think the whole project through, because you can hit issues like things being considered to be an improvement to common property instead of maintenance for common property. And then depending on the cost of the project, and that's got to be the project as a whole, not the individual components of the project separately costed, you might find that you need to get a special resolution if you're above the ordinary resolution limit for improvements. So there's a fair bit to consider, and something that I'm doing at the moment is working with project management companies for them to do something that's called value engineering. So that is to look at a project and what the maximum amount of that cost could be, then work with bodies corporate to say, well, look, get approval for all of that. If it's going to be $1 million maximum, get approval for $1 million. Then authorize your committee to go through the value engineering process. And if you can get that project delivered for $800,000, then there isn't the need to go back and get further body corporate approval. But as can be appreciated, anything that relates to money, there's always many opinions, and sometimes you can't get the necessary approvals to enact some of these important changes. So in terms
James,
of,
can you hear me?
I can now, Julie. Yes, welcome back.
Oh, thank you. There's a few questions I can see that are asking about when we have different contribution and interest entitlements and how they affect the levies and why they're different. Are you maybe able to touch on at the development how that takes place?
Yeah, certainly. So this will depend largely on the age of your building and who developed it. So essentially your contribution schedule lot entitlements are supposed to reflect what you genuinely use in relation to what everybody else uses in the building. So that is not meant to be reflective of the relative values. And there was a case that was getting on now, probably 15 or 20 years ago, that kind of dealt with the fact that developers used to set these two types of entitlements similarly. So they'd say penthouse owners should have higher contribution entitlements than people on the ground floor. And then the Fisher case came through and said, no, that's not right. It's meant to be contribution based on use. And so now in the legislation, we have a couple of principles that apply to new schemes. So the equality principle or the relativity principle. And essentially the position is for your contribution schedule of entitlements, they should all be equal unless there is a good legitimate reason for them to be otherwise based on how the units use the things that the scheme pays for. That's different to your interest schedule lot entitlements, which is meant to reflect your relative value of your unit compared to the other units. And why that's different is that some things like council rates and insurance are based off the interest schedule lot entitlement because they're directly relevant to the value of the unit, and other expenses, like your normal maintenance, lift maintenance, all of those sorts of things, those contributions are based off everybody and the idea that everybody is using those facilities equally. If you're in a scheme that was created prior to those legislative amendments, and I'm going to say that was about 10 years ago, I could be wrong, but schemes that are much older than that, you might have unequal unit entitlements. No joke, people literally went to physical disputes over this when those entitlements changed. In fact, there's a building in Surfers Paradise where somebody fired a gun and a bullet went through a penthouse window over the reallocation of unit entitlements. So government tampered with it several times and then decided to back away from it. So that's why you have different lot entitlements, and that's the reason as to why those are calculated differently for different types of expenses.
Chris, there's a couple of questions in here coming through about electric vehicles. I know QFES recently put out a information brochure on their thoughts around electric vehicle charges in basements. Do you have any comments about what you might have seen in New South Wales or anything you've heard about happening in Queensland, and any problems around installing electric vehicle outlets or having them charging in the garage and the potential of fires?
It's a great question, Julie, and I think it's one that is now starting to become very topical as we try and catch up, if I can use that word, on the need for buildings to retrofit or to provide a spine infrastructure, which means that all properties and all car spaces can have access to electric vehicle infrastructure into the future. So it's important, just before we get to that question, to understand sort of where we've come from. We traditionally, when we talked about electric vehicles in Strata, if you go back 3 or 4 years, it was commonplace to put one charger or a number of chargers in a common property spot and have them available for the isolated owner who may have an electric vehicle. With the focus and the clear desire at a government level to ramp up the number of electric vehicles, apartments and particularly body corporates are going to have to do the vast majority of the accommodation for those vehicles in terms of parking and charging. And what we've seen then is a significant catch up where buildings, particularly older buildings, have had to understand what infrastructure upgrades are required to accommodate, firstly, the metering, but also the capacity behind what's going to be required to have potentially a number, if not the whole of the building in time, charging concurrently overnight. So outside of the physical limitations on how we actually get this infrastructure in, consideration is currently being given to load management, and that's where we're seeing software solutions respond. And many of the current EV charging solutions are about load share, so that regardless of how many apartments or occupiers are charging at once, that load is shared across the system. And so what we're seeing as probably, I guess, the more predominant investigative point at the moment is spine infrastructure being considered, which is infrastructure that creates the ability for each apartment or car space to be able to have an EV charger installed in time. And that allows the user, i.e. the occupant or the owner, to pay a do and charge type cost at the point in time they wish to utilise it. It also means there's not a huge amount of sunk infrastructure for chargers going in where people might not require them for some time. And I think that's also the equity argument. Going down to the safety piece, which was that question, Julie, in New South Wales in particular, there is an increased focus on the gases that have been identified as potentially leaching out when a number of these are being used, particularly in lesser ventilated areas. So there is a particular focus on the electrical safety piece, but also now the occupational safety piece around how it's working. I see this as a bit of an evolving type narrative. There's still not a lot understood about an entire apartment block concurrently charging, particularly when you start to talk about multi-level apartment blocks with hundreds, if not more, car spaces. I think what we need to do is continually just keep our temperature close to how these things are evolving. The technology and the government support by way of grants and investment and education is quite literally exponential in terms of the way it's rolling out. So if there is any interest from any of your clients, I'd suggest that they reach out to your body corporate managers at Capital, and they can provide expertise around any of those questions.
And whilst you're talking, Chris, there was a question when you made comment earlier about storing solar off-site. Are you able to maybe just expand on that and give our viewers a little bit more insight into what you were meaning by that one?
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. So I think traditionally when we've thought about solar PV, photovoltaic cells, we've thought about the rooftop installation specific to that body corporate. And as anyone who knows, there's a number of limitations there around just the spatial accommodation, how many you can fit on the roof, the solar orientation, i.e. they've got to be pointing broadly the right way, otherwise they're ineffective. And also then what space is left based on the fact that a lot of these apartment buildings weren't built with a huge amount of surplus area on the rooftop. So we're starting to see, particularly with bigger buildings, but also with smaller buildings partnering up with different providers, the ability to buy solar energy or to do an arrangement where a solar farm, for example, could be provided off-site, and that off-site can be quite literally anywhere these days, particularly with the way physical infrastructure can be sort of ported and connected up to existing buildings. So you can have an off-site solar PV farm or generation type area which provides power to those properties. And I guess the simplest way of accessing that would be to consider whether your owner's corporation can consider solar or green energy as part of your tariff arrangement or your electricity supply arrangement.
Thank you. And for either Chris or James, we had a question. We'd like to consider saving on hot water costs with the introduction of individual meters to unit owners. Are you aware of any government schemes that may assist to offset some of the costs to introduce meters in such as a way to reduce hot water costs?
I'm not sure if James is more across that in terms of Queensland body corporate incentives. James?
Yeah, not aware of any sort of current schemes, so I must plead ignorance there. What I would say is that there's various benefits to having individual meters, not the least of which is sort of more of a user pays system in relation to water consumption, which can sometimes lead to a bit of dispute in schemes where people feel that the water allocations are not being done properly. What I would say is that there are various experts in both water, energy and hot water provision. I would probably reach out to one of those companies that's expert in this area and get them to undertake an analysis for you. There was talk a while ago, in fact, the government even tried to mandate individual metering, and it was met with a significant amount of pushback. So the other thing would be to make sure that you also win the political battle within your own scheme and try to get everybody on board, because regardless of whether you think it's a good idea and it's going to save the building money, sometimes you get owners that won't support that. But I'd say that's probably one for the energy experts.
James, can I just put a footnote on that as well? I mean, I think you just touched on it. Any initiative in strata, in fact, in any sort of grouped housing type arrangement, the more data you can have, i.e. by measuring the output, the cost or the consumption, means that you can make better decisions. So where possible, any type of energy monitoring, water monitoring, sub-metering, if it is possible to do, typically leads to far greater benefits in terms of the cost, because you can make better decisions, you can make more focused decisions on capacity and usage, but you can also understand then what dials to turn in terms of the benefit you have to your property. And that's what we're seeing, particularly in the more complicated buildings, the multi-member stratums, which might have an overlay between a hotel and an apartment or a commercial. The ability to measure and to separately isolate the consumption amongst those uses is critically important. And if you break that down to a small number of body corporates, 6 townhouses, again, you want to have that individual metering arrangement so you know how to make better decisions about where you deploy your money, your capital upgrades, or how you want to charge your costs.
Yeah, certainly. I think it also dovetails into, I guess one of those sort of holy grails of strata living, which is reasonable decision making. So both the body corporate and its committee must act reasonably and in the interests of all lot owners. And the more independent data you're working with, so if you've used experts and if you're working off data from individual meters, when things need to be done and decisions need to be made, so much easier for the committee and the body corporate to demonstrate the reasonability of its decision making, particularly if you're talking about spending a large amount of money.
James, another question for you. With some of our schemes, maybe from around the 2000s, just wondering what's our position in our legislation where owners might look at their contribution and interest entitlements and want to change them, or even start that dialogue about changing them. what would you suggest, and which ways do we go to do that?
Yeah, certainly. It's become increasingly difficult. As I said, when the legislation sort of first changed, there was this gold rush, I guess, or an absolute watershed moment where everybody rushed out and tried to change things, and then the legislation went back the other way, and there was a massive outpour of people wanting to change it back. Essentially, if you want to change unit entitlements, it requires a resolution without dissent, which means that nobody who is present at the meeting and eligible to vote votes against that motion. So you can get a resolution without dissent if people aren't present or choose not to vote. But I think you should approach it on the basis of saying, if we get one naysayer, then we're not going to be able to get this over the line. So in terms of how do you approach that, with caution, with transparency, and treat it as a campaign. One of the things that surprises me still in Strata is that, bodies corporate are like mini governments. You've got a committee that's a bit like, cabinet, and then you've got the lot owners at general meeting that's a lot like parliament, and people put up motions and then just sit and wait to see what happens. This is a political beast, and so you do need to lobby for the change that you want. You may need to go around long before you even put your motion forward and see if people are prepared to support it, what that motion would look like. So I would campaign heavily because this is one of those zero-sum games where there is only so many lot owners that have to pay for things, and somebody's gain is somebody else's loss. And you may have some very altruistic people in the building that can see, hey, you know what, the reality is you've probably been subsidising me for many years, and it would only be fair for us to even this out. But you may also get people that act as rational sort of maximisers of their own utility and say, we don't care about you. And maybe timing's important too. At the moment, while costs of living are increasing and everybody's probably worrying more about their own hip pocket, might not be a great time to try and get that through. But essentially, resolution without dissent. There used to be a more direct process for challenging when a resolution without dissent wasn't obtained to go off to QCAT. It's become a lot more difficult and a lot sort of more clouded. So I would say, if you can't get the resolution without dissent, then seek legal advice about what to do next, because it's not as simple as it used to be.
Larissa, we may throw a question to you just around finances. You can do it. Don't be alarmed. We just had a question. What are the rules on being made more aware of special levy fees, not being such a surprise or controlling the value of these extra fees? Where is the line drawn with this, as in the special levy value being an unreasonable amount to unit owners when we are unaware this was coming?
Yeah, sure. So back to legislation. The legislation states that if there's not a provision in the budget for an expense that's arising, the only other option is to raise a special levy. That's the legislative requirement. So obviously, collectively, owners, being the body corporate, need to form those funds in order to meet the liability. In terms of it being a surprise, it goes to a general meeting. So lot owners do receive the notice. They can participate in the voting. They have an opportunity to ask questions and, of course, seek further information from the committee if, the information provided in the meeting agenda doesn't suffice. So it's a collective decision of the body corporate. The committee cannot resolve to issue a special levy. So does that answer the question?
So just to add on, you do have that notice period, so there would be that at least 21, 25, 28 days don't have the notice of the general meeting before that is voted on. And if they are looking at striking a special levy, no doubt there's been a committee meeting, there's already been some dialogue amongst the committee, discussion about what works are required, quotations obtained, and you would have seen committee minutes or committee resolutions. So for it to come out of the blue as a shock, that shouldn't happen, because there should be some committee discussion, resolution, and that distributed to the owners. You've got your notice of meeting potentially up to 30+ days before the meeting. And like Larissa said, the value of the special levy is going to be in line with what works need to be undertaken. Was there anything else, James, that you could add to that?
Yeah, certainly. In most of my advices, I will recommend that any amount of major spending is approached like it's a mini project in and of itself. So special levies are one way to raise money. Now, depending on how much money we're talking about and how urgent we need to raise it, things like adjusting the budget and increasing levies over time may work, may not. Striking special levies that require a lump sum or a series of significant lump sums over time could be the right thing, or perhaps getting a strata loan. And I feel that for bodies corporate to make intelligent financial decisions, they need to put all options on the table. So for anyone that feels as though you know, they've been sort of caught by surprise, perhaps get into that dialogue earlier when you get the you know, note the sort of advice of the committee having decided to put the issue to a general meeting for to raise a special levy, then maybe that's the time to jump in and say, hey, I'd like to propose an alternative of looking at a strata loan, and those things might be able to be dealt with as same issues motions, or you may be able to discuss them prior and work out an option that best suits you. Up until recently, I have not been aware of any way in which a strata loan could proceed where some people paid up front and some people paid the loan off in their levies. I've since become aware that there's a company out there, and I've looked at their strategy and it stacks up legally. There is a company that can provide loans in Queensland, well, actually nationally, but you know, we're in Queensland, where owners can then choose and say, well, look, I want to pay the special levy. We'll get a loan. I want to pay my portion of it. Everyone else can pay theirs off over time if they like. But I think get that discussion happening about the different options of payment.
Can I just add a footnote to that, James, that hybrid loan? And I have looked at it for a couple of schemes for different projects. And like any body corporate loan, if they're going to go down that path, there will be terms and conditions, and that might not fit all schemes. And it will be dependent on the size of the loan, the number of lots, what lot owners they might have in arrears. So we are seeing that really coming into the marketplace. It won't be a be-all, fit-all answer for everyone. So like our loan, we'll still need to get all our information. And then it may be no, but for some of them, hopefully it will be yeses, and it may be a different way to move forward.
Julie, can I just touch on that? Because we're starting to see some of these more innovative loan products, which I think are very helpful in the marketplace because they give funding options to owners. And as you expressed, those funding options need to be considered by the body corporate. There are a number of factors which will need to be taken into place in terms of the circumstances. But the fact that better options are starting to be available to owners, i.e. those hybrid funding facilities, which may allow an owner to pay up front and another to take out a loan facility, because I think it expresses the fact that not all financial circumstances are the same. And we're now seeing the market meet some of that, I guess, investment options or the choice that owners need to have with some more innovative financial products. And I would couch that with everyone needs to ensure they do their appropriate research into those products, but there is an emerging number of solutions available to owners to sort and suit your financing needs on an ongoing basis.
James, I know you and I have had discussions around this before, and it comes back to what we've discussed, I think, on a couple of different webinars, is about maintenance of your building. We've got, how can you control high body corporate fees that keep increasing in relation to the D value in unit value, where our units have not really increased. They've been selling lower than what we paid 20 years ago.
Yeah, certainly. Well, look, I think body corporate financial decision making and financial health is a factor of several things. So how well funded the body corporate is, the existence or otherwise of, you know, defects, the amount of kind of infrastructure that needs to be maintained, and much like any sort of household or personal budget, the body corporate needs to to look at these things and the sort of apparent life cycle of its building, and sometimes make some really difficult decisions. Something that I'm seeing more and more in the market now, it has always happened, but it used to be a bit rarer, was insurers actually entering this discussion and sort of saying, well, this is now an insurance issue. So if you want to continue to be covered for insurance, you now must do this essential maintenance, and takes, in many cases, takes the issue out of the body corporate's hands. But you know, one of the things that I will get schemes in this situation to look at is the viability of a collective sale or termination. Now, that is incredibly rare and it's not for everyone, but much like we talked about with the strata loans, you should consider all possibilities. And when you're looking down the barrel of, would we consider terminating this scheme altogether, or would we look at collectively selling, and that doesn't seem like a good option to you, then that takes one of the potential avenues off the board and puts you back into the, well, how much money do you need and how are you going to go about funding it? So some schemes will find themselves in that kind of Bermuda triangle of the buildings are only worth so much, and you know, the cost to maintain is ever increasing. I would say get consultants in, and I know, you know, that seems a bit counterintuitive because you've got to then spend money to see how you might be able to save money, but get consultants in to look at the viability of what they call sort of bringing forward proactive maintenance. So if you've got to put up scaffolding to do one job, why not do 10 jobs while the scaffolding's there, and then you don't have the scaffolding costs? You know, that's just one example. So get a project manager or an expert in to kind of say, well, look, if we were to fix everything in your building, this is the cheapest way that could be done, or it's more viable to step this out over time. I would also look at getting a development consultant in to give you an idea about what the redevelopment value of your building is. So I'm not an expert in that area, but something that I have noticed through going through this process several times is that there are some buildings out there that have a particular building footprint where the units do not take up even the majority of the you know, available land space, and that is something that could factor into the redevelopment potential of that site. So if you overlay all of those things, you'll kind of look at this is what the future of maintenance looks like. This is what the, you know, redevelopment of our scheme looks like. This is what borrowing to fix it looks like. This is what levying to fix it looks like. And if all of that looks horrible, this is what termination looks like. And unfortunately, tough decision, but one that if it goes too far, your insurer will make for you, and nobody wants to be jointly and severally liable for anything that happens on scheme land if their insurer avoids coverage.
Thanks, James. Chris, if we could just finish with one question to you. I did see a couple come through. Could you explain what you mean by a cost value analysis? I think around the sustainability and a couple of the things you touched on.
Look, absolutely. I mean, in short, it's a small business case around the cost versus the benefit of installing sustainability infrastructure. So put very simply, anything you do is going to have a cost attached to it. So let's assume that you want to install solar panels, solar PV, solar voltaic cells, as they're called. If you want to install those on your property, they're going to cost X. And for the purpose of this exercise, let's say $10,000. You will then be able, with an expert or a provider, be able to determine what saving you'll make as a result of putting that infrastructure in. And you might save $1,000 a year on your electricity based on that supply side saving, but also the fact that you generate. So put simplistically, to spend $10,000 and to save $1,000 each year is a 10-year payback period. And often we see government supports and incentives which might bring that 10-year payback period back to 5 years because you get a subsidy from the government when you put in place some of these initiatives. So that's what I mean by a cost benefit analysis or a business case. And at the outset, I talked about the fact that our ownership in property is increasing in tenure, i.e. we're holding it more. So then it comes down to the fact that you're making decisions that you'll get the benefit from and the payback from in your lifetime. And the overrider to that is be mindful that those energy efficient features are being sought by people purchasing in strata. So you add to that the potential uplift in value, and then you've got what I call a business case behind why you should be considering the installation of infrastructure. And that doesn't factor in the fact that electricity costs are likely to continue going up, so which means that payback period will reduce potentially over time. That's the type of investigation you should do to be able to present these business cases to your fellow owners.
Thank you. Back to you, Larissa.
All righty. Thank you everybody for joining, and especially thanks to Chris, James and Julie for sharing your knowledge with us all. As always, it is very much appreciated. For those attending, please don't forget to submit your feedback. Scan the QR code that you'll see on your screen right about now, and you will go into the draw to win the $100 Visa prepaid card, which will be announced on Tuesday, September 27th. We'll send the full recording of the webinar out soon, so keep your eyes open for that. And we look forward to having you all at our next Capital Connect webinar.